My life was a grid. A perfectly aligned, color-coded, and meticulously planned grid. From the moment my alarm chimed at 6:30 in the morning to the precise angle at which I placed my worn paperback on my nightstand at 10:30 at night, every action was a known quantity. As a graphic designer, I suppose it was my nature to impose order on chaos, but my personal life was my magnum opus of control. It was a fortress built of routine, and its high, smooth walls kept everything unpredictable, everything messy, safely on the other side. Loneliness was the price of admission, a quiet hum beneath the surface of my days. But it was a familiar ache, a manageable one. It was certainly better than the alternative, the terrifying freefall of vulnerability. Then, there was Elias Vance. He was not part of the grid. He was a force of nature, a geological event that threatened the very foundations of my carefully constructed world. Elias was the lead architect and the primary client on the Solitude Peak Lodge project, the biggest account our firm had ever landed. He was a man carved from something sturdier than the rest of us, all broad shoulders and quiet confidence. He moved with an unhurried grace that seemed to calm the very air around him, and when he spoke, his voice was a low, thoughtful rumble, like distant thunder on a summer evening. He was, in a word, magnificent, and he was utterly, terrifyingly, off-limits. He was a client. The client. He existed in a different stratum of the professional world, a place of power and decision-making, while I was just one of the cogs in the machine, a designer tasked with making his architectural visions look appealing on a glossy brochure. To him, I was probably just the branding guy or Julian from marketing in my world. However, he was the sun, and I was a minor planet caught in his orbit, content to observe his light from a safe, sterile distance. Our interactions were limited to weekly project meetings. I would sit on the far side of the massive oak conference table, my laptop a shield, and I would watch him. I cataloged the details of his existence with the secret, fervent intensity of a museum curator tending to a priceless exhibit. I knew the way he'd push his black-framed glasses up the bridge of his nose with one long finger when he was deep in thought. I knew the scent of his cologne, a subtle, clean fragrance of sandalwood and something sharp like bergamot that would linger in the room long after he'd left. I knew the faint crinkles that appeared at the corners of his eyes when one of my senior colleagues made a joke that actually landed. These observations were my secret treasure. I would take them home with me, turning them over in my mind in the quiet of my apartment. He was a piece of art I could admire but never touch. The barrier between us wasn't just professional, it was a chasm of perceived difference. He moved through the world with an ease I couldn't comprehend. I imagined he had a beautiful, architecturally perfect home, probably a smart, sophisticated wife who understood his quiet moods, maybe a golden retriever. He was the epitome of a life lived in the sun, while I resided in the carefully managed shade. Any fantasy I dared to entertain was immediately quashed by a brutal wave of reality. He was the client. He was, for all I knew, completely straight. He was, in every conceivable way, unattainable. And so, I kept him safely behind the glass of my admiration, a beautiful, impossible dream that added a splash of vibrant, aching color to my otherwise monochrome existence. The disruption came, as disruptions often do, on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a frantic phone call from my boss, Sarah. The final presentation for the Solitude Peak Lodge branding package was scheduled for the next day, on-site, up in the mountains where the flagship hotel was in its final stages of construction. Sarah was supposed to drive up and walk Elias through the final proofs. But her daughter had come down with a sudden, raging fever, and she was, justifiably, in no state to leave. "Julian, I'm so sorry," she'd said, her voice strained over the sound of a child crying in the background. "I know it's last minute, but you know this project better than anyone. It's just a sign-off. You just need to get him to initial the proofs. Can you do it?" A cold spike of panic shot through me. Alone? With Elias? Not in the sterile safety of the conference room, buffered by a dozen other colleagues, but on his turf? The thought sent my carefully ordered internal systems into a state of emergency. My mouth went dry. "Me? Are you sure?" I'd asked, my voice a weak imitation of its normal register. "You'll be fine. It's a straight shot up the mountain. Just be prepared for some weather. They're forecasting a bit of a storm, but you should be able to get up and back before it really hits. A bit of a storm. The words were a masterpiece of understatement. The drive up the winding mountain road was a slow descent into a world of white. The rain that had been pattering against my windshield in the city turned to sleet, then to thick, wet flakes of snow that clung to the pines lining the road like damp shrouds. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray, and the world outside my car seemed to be shrinking, the visibility reducing with every mile. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This was chaos. This was the antithesis of my grit. I found the site, a clearing carved out of the dense forest where the skeleton of the main lodge rose against the snow-filled sky. Elias had told Sarah he'd be working out of the completed model cabin, a smaller, separate structure a few hundred yards from the main construction zone. I pulled up just as the snow began to fall in earnest, a blinding, swirling curtain of white. He was waiting on the porch of the cabin, a dark, solid silhouette against the pale landscape. He wore a heavy charcoal gray wool coat and watched my car skid to a halt with a neutral expression. I grabbed the portfolio case from the passenger seat, my hands trembling slightly, and stepped out into the biting wind. "Julian, right?" he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the howl of the wind. "Glad you made it. It's getting nasty out there." Sarah sends her apologies. I managed, my words stolen by the wind. "No worries. Family first," he said, opening the heavy wooden door. "Come on in. Get out of that." The moment I stepped inside, the world changed. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the crackle of a fire in a large stone hearth and the low hum of what I assumed was a generator. The cabin was a testament to his design philosophy. It was all clean lines, warm wood, and wide windows that, in better weather, would have offered a stunning view of the valley below. Now, they just showed a swirling vortex of white. The air was thick with the scent of pine, sawdust, and something else, that familiar, clean scent of sandalwood that was uniquely his. It filled the space, and it filled my lungs, and suddenly the cabin felt both incredibly vast and terrifyingly small. My fortress had been breached. I was inside the exhibit, and the glass had just vanished. The first hour was a masterpiece of professional awkwardness. We sat at a large drafting table, the portfolio of my designs spread between us like a negotiated truce. I pointed to color palettes and font choices, my voice feeling thin and reedy in the warm, quiet space. Elias listened intently, nodding, his focus absolute. He was all business, his presence a solid, grounding weight on the other side of the table. But I was hyper-aware of everything else. I was aware of the way the firelight caught the silver at his temples. I was aware of the faint dusting of sawdust on the sleeve of his dark flannel shirt. I was aware of the sheer proximity of him, close enough that if I stretched out my hand, I could touch his. The thought was so alarming, so fundamentally against the rules of my universe, that I had to physically curl my fingers into a fist under the table. He signed off on the proofs with a decisive flourish of a pen. "It's good work, Julian. Really good. Sarah was right. You have a great eye." The compliment landed in my chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you." I mumbled, my gaze fixed on the papers. The business was concluded. My purpose here was fulfilled. All I had to do was pack up and leave. But when I glanced at the window, my stomach plummeted. The world outside was gone. It was just an impenetrable wall of white. The snow wasn't just falling anymore. It was a horizontal blizzard, a furious, howling entity. Elias followed my gaze, his expression unreadable. He pulled his phone from his pocket, frowned at the screen. "No service," he said, his voice calm. He walked over to a landline on a small desk in the corner and lifted the receiver. He listened for a moment, then placed it back in its cradle. "Line's dead." He looked at me, and for the first time, the professional veneer seemed to crack just a little. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, concern, maybe, resignation. "Well," he said, his voice still that impossibly steady rumble. "Looks like you're not going anywhere." The words hung in the air between us, as thick and heavy as the snow outside. "Stuck." The word echoed in the quiet chambers of my mind. I was stuck here, with him. The grid of my life didn't just have a crack in it. It had been shattered, blown apart by a force of nature, and I was adrift in the wreckage. The silence that followed was profound. It was filled with the howl of the wind and the frantic, silent screaming of my own anxiety. Elias, however, seemed completely unfazed. He was a man accustomed to dealing with the unexpected, a builder who knew that sometimes nature simply wins. He moved with a calm purposefulness that I found both unnerving and deeply soothing. "First things first," he said, his voice cutting through my internal panic. "Coffee, or something stronger." "Coffee is fine," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. He set about making a pot of coffee on a surprisingly high-end espresso machine that seemed to run off the generator. The simple, domestic act was so at odds with my image of him as this powerful, untouchable client. I watched his large, capable hands move with precision, tamping the grounds, frothing the milk. He didn't speak, and I was grateful for the silence. It gave me a moment to try and reassemble the scattered pieces of my composure. I focused on the sensory details, a familiar grounding technique. The rich, dark scent of the coffee beans, the hiss of the steam wand, the solid, reassuring thud of the ceramic mugs as he placed them on the heavy wooden table. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine for a fleeting, electric second. The contact was nothing, a meaningless accident, but it sent a jolt straight up my arm. My carefully constructed walls, already compromised, trembled. I pulled my hand back as if burned. I didn't think he noticed. "The roads will be closed until morning, at least," he said, taking a sip from his own mug and gazing out the window at the white chaos. "Probably longer, if this keeps up. We've got plenty of firewood, and the generator's got a full tank of diesel. There's food. We'll be fine." The word was a small, intimate bomb. It tethered us together, two strangers bound by a storm. My mind raced, trying to process the new reality. My perfectly planned evening, a quiet meal, a book, bed at 10:30, was gone. In its place was this terrifying, unpredictable intimacy. As the afternoon bled into a dark, stormy evening, a strange sort of rhythm established itself. Elias worked for a while, poring over a set of blueprints under the warm glow of a desk lamp. I pretended to answer emails on my laptop, though with no internet connection, I was just staring at my own neatly organized inbox. The silence between us wasn't entirely comfortable, but it was no longer screamingly awkward. It was a shared space, filled with the constant, wild soundtrack of the blizzard. For dinner, he found 2 cans of chili and a box of crackers in a well-stocked pantry. We ate sitting on stools at the kitchen island, the simple meal feeling strangely significant. The professional roles of client and designer had been stripped away by the storm. We were just 2 men, sharing a meal, waiting for the weather to break. It was then that he offered the first crack in his own fortress. He was looking into the fire, his expression distant. "This project," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "It's everything. My last big one went over budget, behind schedule. A total disaster. My old firm, we parted ways. This lodge, this is my chance to prove I'm not washed up." I was so taken aback by the sudden vulnerability that I didn't know what to say. The invincible Elias Vance, the man I'd placed on a pedestal, was admitting to failure, to insecurity. It was like watching a statue bleed. It made him real. It made him human. "The designs are incredible," I said, and the words were true, untainted by my personal feelings. "It's going to be a huge success. Everyone at the firm thinks so." He looked over at me, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "Thanks, Julian." He said my name like it was a solid object, something with weight and texture. Hearing it in his voice, in this quiet, intimate space, was a revelation. I wasn't just the branding guy, I was Julian. Later, the generator sputtered and died. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged us into a sudden, profound darkness, broken only by the flickering orange glow of the fire. The silence that rushed in was different. The hum of the generator had been a modern sound, a link to the outside world. Now, there was only the wind and the fire. The primal sounds. "Well, damn," Elias's voice came out of the dark. "Ran out of fuel sooner than I thought." A new kind of cold began to seep into the room, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of isolation, of being truly cut off. I shivered, hugging my arms to my chest. "It's going to get cold in here fast," he said. I could hear him moving, his shape a darker shadow against the firelight. "The fireplace in the bedroom is more efficient. It'll keep that room warm through the night. He paused, and I could feel the weight of his unasked question hanging in the dark. The cabin had one bedroom, one bed. My mind, which had been in a state of low-grade panic all day, went into a full-blown red alert. The grid, the walls, the fortress, they were all gone. I was standing in the ruins, completely exposed. The sofa's not an option, he continued, his voice practical, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a structural issue with a contractor. The draft from that main window is brutal. We'd freeze. He was right. It was a simple, logical conclusion, a matter of survival. But my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it across the dark room. "We can share the bed," he said, and the words were just a statement of fact, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. "For warmth. That's all." I couldn't speak. I could only nod into the darkness, a useless gesture he couldn't possibly see. I think he understood my silence as assent. "Okay then," he said softly. "Let's get the fire in there built up." The bedroom was small, dominated by a large bed piled with thick quilts and woolen blankets. Elias efficiently built up the fire in the smaller hearth until it was roaring, casting dancing shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The air grew warm and close. He disappeared into the adjoining bathroom and came back a few minutes later, stripped down to a plain gray t-shirt and a pair of dark sweatpants. My eyes snagged on the sight of his bare arms, the strong lines of his shoulders visible even through the soft cotton of the shirt. "Bathroom's all yours," he said, not meeting my eyes. He pulled back the covers on one side of the bed. "I'll take this side." I felt like I was moving through a dream. I went into the bathroom, my movements stiff and robotic. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and something else, something I refused to name. I didn't have a change of clothes, so I just took off my shoes and my button-down shirt, leaving me in my jeans and t-shirt. It felt inadequate, too constricting for sleep, but it was the best I could do. When I came out, Elias was already in bed, lying on his back on the far side, his hands folded over his chest. He'd left a wide, uncrossable expanse of mattress between us, a demilitarized zone. I walked to my side of the bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor, and slid under the covers. The mattress dipped under my weight. The sheets were cool, but the air around me was filled with the heat radiating from his body. It was a living, breathing warmth that was utterly different from the dry heat of the fire. I lay perfectly still, my back to him, my muscles wound so tight I thought they might snap. I could hear him breathing, a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet room. I tried to match my own ragged breaths to his, a desperate attempt to find some semblance of calm. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely howl of the wind outside. I was more intensely aware of another human being than I had ever been in my life. I could feel the subtle shift of the mattress as he moved, could sense the solid mass of him just inches away. My carefully ordered world had been reduced to this single, terrifying, exhilarating point in space and time. This bed, this man, this storm. I must have shivered, a small, involuntary tremor. His voice, when it came, was a low murmur in the dark, startlingly close. "You cold?" I shook my head, then realized he couldn't see. "No, I'm okay." The lie was thin and brittle. Another long silence. I could feel him shift behind me, the mattress moving with more purpose this time. I held my breath. I felt, rather than saw, him turn onto his side, facing my back. The heat at my back intensified, a palpable wave of warmth that seemed to soak through my clothes, through my skin, and into my very bones. "Julian," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was not a question. It was a statement. Just my name, spoken into the small, warm space between us. Something inside me broke. Some final, load-bearing wall that I had spent years reinforcing. It crumbled into dust. Slowly, tentatively, I turned over to face him. In the flickering firelight, his face was a landscape of shadow and light. His eyes were dark, serious, and they were fixed on mine. He wasn't smiling. He just looked. He looked at me with an intensity that stripped away every defense I had ever erected. He was seeing me, not the quiet designer, not the anxious overthinker, just me. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead. His fingers were warm and slightly calloused, and the touch was so tender, so unexpected, that it made my breath catch in my throat. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his thumb now tracing the line of my jaw. I couldn't find my voice. I could only give the smallest of nods, a motion that felt like it took all the strength I possessed. It was a surrender, a confession. That was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, closing the final few inches between us. His lips met mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was soft, hesitant, a gentle pressure that asked more than it took. His lips were warm and dry. I could taste the faint hint of coffee and something that was just him. I responded instinctively, my own lips parting slightly, answering his unspoken question with one of my own. The kiss deepened, but slowly, like a sunrise. It was a careful exploration, a mapping of new territory. His hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady as if he feared I might bolt. And I might have. But the overwhelming sensation was not fear. It was a profound, earth-shattering sense of rightness. It felt like coming home to a place I had never known existed. My own hands, which had been frozen at my sides, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palm, a rhythm that seemed to anchor me in the swirling chaos of the moment. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. The fire crackled. The wind howled. My perfectly ordered world was gone, and in its place was this. Just this. And it was terrifying. And it was perfect. The morning after was a brutal return to reality. I woke slowly, drawn from a deep, dreamless sleep by a sliver of impossibly bright sunlight cutting through a gap in the curtains. The storm had broken. The world outside was silent, muffled by a thick blanket of fresh snow. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I felt only a profound sense of peace. My body was warm, relaxed. Then, memory came rushing back in a tidal wave. Elias. The cabin. The kiss. I turned my head. The other side of the bed was empty. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow, the sheets still warm. I sat up, my heart beginning a low, anxious thrum. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I found him in the main room. He was already dressed in jeans and a fresh sweater, standing by the main window with a mug of coffee in his hand, staring out at the transformed landscape. The sun on the snow was blinding. He didn't turn when I entered the room. The easy intimacy of the night, forged in darkness and firelight, had evaporated in the harsh light of day. A thick, impenetrable wall of silence stood between us. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. It was his client voice, the one he used in meetings. "The plows are already out. I heard them on the main road a few minutes ago. We should be able to get you down the mountain in an hour or two-inch." Every word was a small, sharp icicle to the heart. He was all business. Practical. He was fixing the problem, and the problem, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach, was me. Last night had been a mistake. A moment of weakness, a bizarre side effect of the storm, the isolation, the shared body heat for survival scenario. He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. My anxiety, which had been blissfully dormant, roared back to life, a caged animal set free. My mind became a courtroom where I was both prosecutor and defendant. I replayed every moment of the previous night, twisting it, reinterpreting it through this new, horrifying lens. His kindness was pity. His vulnerability was a calculated risk he now regretted. The kiss was a catastrophic misjudgment, an unforgivable breach of a professional boundary that I had allowed, that I had encouraged. I hadn't just let him knock down my walls. I had helped him, handing him the sledgehammer. And now I was standing in the rubble of my own making, and he was politely pretending not to see the mess. "I'll, just get my things," I stammered, my voice sounding alien to my own ears. I retreated to the bedroom, the scene of the crime, and gathered my portfolio, my jacket, my shoes. I felt like a trespasser. When I emerged, he had a mug of coffee waiting for me on the table. I couldn't meet his eyes. The drive down the mountain was an exercise in silent torture. The world outside was achingly beautiful, a pristine winter wonderland of snow-laden pines and sparkling sunlight. Inside the cab of his large truck, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was thick with unspoken words, with regret, with the ghost of a kiss that I was now convinced I had imagined into something it was not. Elias kept his eyes on the winding, cleared road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was radiating attention that was a mirror of my own. I interpreted his silence as confirmation of my deepest fears. He was angry, or embarrassed, or both. He couldn't wait to be rid of me. He dropped me at my car, which was covered in a thick layer of snow near the entrance to the construction site. The engine of his truck rumbled, an impatient sound. "I'll let Sarah know the proofs are signed," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Thanks for making the trip up. It was a dismissal. Clean, professional, final." "Of course," I said, my voice hollow. I got out of the truck and closed the door. He didn't wait for me to get into my own car. He just put the truck in gear and drove away, leaving me alone in the vast, silent, snowy landscape. The drive home was a blur. My mind was a relentless loop of self-recrimination. I had ruined everything. Not just a potential friendship, but a professional relationship. I would be the designer who made things awkward with the firm's biggest client. I would have to see him in meetings, have to pretend that night in the cabin never happened, have to live with the memory of that kiss, a memory that was now tainted with shame and regret. The next few days were hell. I went to work, sat at my desk, and moved pixels around on a screen, but I was a ghost. I felt hollowed out, my inside scoured clean by anxiety. I jumped every time the phone rang, every time an email from him landed in my inbox, expecting it to be a formal complaint to my boss. But there was nothing, just silence. The silence was worse. It was a vacuum where my fears could grow, monstrous and unchecked. On Friday afternoon, an email arrived. The subject line was simply, "Coffee." It was from Elias. My blood ran cold. This was it. The official, "let's pretend this never happened and never speak of it again" conversation. The final nail in the coffin of my foolish, fleeting hope. I typed back a single word. "Okay." We met at a small, neutral cafe halfway between my office and his. The place was busy, filled with the lunchtime chatter of strangers. The anonymity should have been comforting, but it only made me feel more exposed. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing by the counter, and even in this mundane setting, he seemed to command the space around him. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. He carried 2 coffees to a small table in the corner and sat down opposite me. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable, and said the words I had been dreading. "We need to talk about what happened at the cabin." I braced myself. I arranged my features into what I hoped was a mask of calm professionalism. I was ready for the rejection, for the awkward apology, for the erasure of that night. "Okay," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He looked deeply, profoundly weary. "I've been an idiot, Julian," he began, and the words were not what I expected. The way I acted, the morning after. The drive down the mountain. "I'm sorry. I handled that horribly." I just stared at him, confused. This wasn't the script I had written in my head. "I panicked," he continued, his voice low, forcing me to lean in to hear him over the cafe's din. "I woke up that morning, and all I could think was that I had taken advantage of the situation, that I had crossed a line, a massive professional line, and made you uncomfortable. I saw the look on your face, and I assumed you regretted it. So I did what I always do when I'm scared. I shut down. I put the walls up." He put the walls up. The phrase was so familiar, so much a part of my own vocabulary, that hearing it from him was a shock. "I thought you regretted it," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I thought it was a mistake." He looked at me then, and his eyes were so full of a raw, aching vulnerability that it took my breath away. "A mistake," he said, a humorless laugh escaping him. "Julian, I have been thinking about kissing you for 3 months. Every damn meeting, I'd sit there, trying to focus on fonts and color schemes, and all I could think about was what it would be like to get you alone, away from that conference table." My world tilted on its axis. 3 months. He had been watching me, too. I kept telling myself it was impossible. He went on, his gaze intense. "You were the designer. I was the client. You were quiet. I couldn't get a read on you. I assumed you weren't interested. Or that you were straight." He gave a small shrug. I'm not exactly broadcasting my own status these days. My divorce was messy. I've just been focused on work. Divorce. So there was no wife. No perfectly curated life. Just a man, like me, who had built walls to protect himself. A man who was just as scared as I was. When Sarah called and said you were coming up instead of her, he admitted, a faint flush creeping up his neck, I was glad. And when the storm hit, a part of me, a terrible, selfish part of me, was thrilled. I never would have had the guts to make a move otherwise. But that night, that wasn't a mistake. It was the only thing that's felt real to me in a very long time. The dam of my own fear, my own carefully guarded feelings, finally broke. I thought you were out of my league. I confessed, the words a quiet rush. I've had a crush on you since our very first meeting. I watched you. I thought you were this perfect, untouchable person with a perfect life. I never, in a million years, thought you would even see me. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed his tired features. It was like the sun coming out after the storm. Oh, I saw you, Julian, he said softly. I saw the way you chew on your pen when you were concentrating. I saw the way your whole face lit up when you were talking about a design you were proud of. I saw you, and I just wanted to get closer. The relief that washed over me was so profound it was almost painful. It was the feeling of a pressure I hadn't even realized I was carrying suddenly being released. All the anxiety, all the self-doubt, all the fear of the last few days just dissolved. We sat in silence for a moment, just looking at each other over our cooling coffees, the noise of the cafe fading into a distant hum. We were two cartographers who had been secretly mapping the same territory, each believing he was alone in his exploration. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His touch was warm, solid, and sure. There was no hesitation in it. So, he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. Can we start over? Not as client and designer. Just as us. Yes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I'd like that. He paid for the coffee, and we walked out into the cold, bright afternoon. We walked for a block in comfortable silence before he stopped me under the awning of a closed shop. He turned to face me, his hands finding their way into his pockets. Just to be clear, he said, a playful, conspiratorial glint in his eye. This is me, officially asking you on a date. Dinner. Tomorrow night. Somewhere with no snow and 2 separate beds, just in case. I laughed, a real, unburdened laugh that felt like it came from a place deep inside me that had been locked away for years. I think I can handle dinner, I said. He smiled, that slow, warm smile that made my heart ache in the best possible way. And then, right there on the busy sidewalk, he leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was nothing like the first one in the cabin. There was no hesitation, no question. It was confident, deep, and full of the relief and promise of everything we had just confessed. It was a statement, a beginning. It felt like coming home. Our first date was a study in glorious, fumbling awkwardness. Without the high stakes of a blizzard or the buffer of a conference table, we were just 2 men trying to figure each other out. We went to a small Italian restaurant, and for the first 20 minutes, we talked about the weather and the traffic, the conversational equivalent of circling a runway, too nervous to land. But then Elias told a self-deprecating story about his first ever architectural model, which involved a catastrophic incident with too much glue and his parents' cat, and I found myself laughing, really laughing. I, in turn, told him about a disastrous branding project from early in my career for a dog food company that insisted on using a terrifying, grinning chihuahua as its logo. Slowly, the roles we had assigned each other, the unattainable client, the quiet designer, began to flake away, revealing the real men underneath. I learned that his quiet confidence was a shield for a deep-seated fear of not being good enough, a fear born from his previous business failure. He learned that my orderly routines were a defense mechanism against a world that often felt too loud, too chaotic, too overwhelming. We were 2 sides of the same coin, each of us having built a fortress to protect a soft, vulnerable heart. He drove me home, and as he walked me to my apartment door, a comfortable silence settled between us. The night was cold and clear. At my door, I fumbled for my keys, my fingers suddenly clumsy. I had a really good time, I said, finally finding the right key. Me too, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet hallway. He reached out, not to kiss me, but to gently take the keys from my hand. He unlocked the door for me, his knuckles brushing against mine. He pushed the door open, then handed the keys back. The gesture was so simple, so considerate, it made my chest ache. "So," I said, hesitating in the doorway. "So," he echoed, a small smile playing on his lips. He leaned in and gave me a soft, chaste kiss. "Good night, Julian." And then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in my doorway, my heart full to bursting. The weeks that followed were a quiet unfolding. We kept things discreet, not wanting the gossip mill at my firm to affect the final stages of the Solitude Peak project. But our secrecy created its own kind of intimacy. A shared glance across the conference table held a world of meaning. A brief, accidental touch of hands as we both reached for a blueprint sent a jolt of private electricity between us. We built a new world in the margins of our old one, a world made of late-night phone calls, quiet dinners at my apartment, and long walks where we talked about everything and nothing. One Saturday, we drove up to the lodge. The construction was nearly complete, and the place was magnificent. He gave me a private tour, his voice filled with a quiet pride as he pointed out the grain of the reclaimed wood, the way the light fell through the massive windows he had designed. We ended up at the model cabin, the scene of our accidental beginning. It was clean and empty now, waiting for its first official guests. We stood in the bedroom, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. The bed was neatly made with crisp, white linens. It looked so different from how I remembered it, all shadows and firelight and desperation. "Strange to be back here," I said softly. Elias came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder. "Is it?" he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "To me, it feels like the most important place on earth." He turned his head and kissed my neck. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice playful. "This room is going to need some art. Maybe a nice, minimalist print. Something with a clean grid design." I laughed, leaning my head back against his shoulder. "I might know a guy." That night, curled up together in my bed, a space that was unequivocally mine, and now, ours. I lay awake long after his breathing had deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. His arm was draped possessively over my waist, his body a solid, warm anchor at my back. The quiet hum of my apartment was a world away from the howling wind of the storm that had thrown us together. I thought about my old life, my life of grids and walls and carefully managed solitude. It had been a safe life, a predictable one, but it had been a life lived in black and white. Elias, with his quiet strength and his surprising vulnerability, had crashed into my world and saturated it with color. He hadn't just breached my fortress. He had shown me that the safety I had craved was a gilded cage. True safety wasn't in the absence of risk. It was in the presence of someone who saw your walls, who understood why they were there, and who gently, patiently, helped you take them down, brick by brick. A snowstorm had trapped me in a cabin, but it was Elias who had set me free.